Now, it's going to come up in different contexts, but the judge is going to instruct you on the principle of abandonment. And it has more than one application here, but basically, if somebody abandons a criminal enterprise, then they cannot be held criminally responsible for it. Maybe you believe that Mr. Bryan was attempting to falsely imprison Mr. Arbery. Of course, that would depend on whether or not the McMichaels were authorized to make a citizen's arrest. We'll talk more about those issues later. But this is a defense, and it is the burden of the state to disprove that defense beyond a reasonable doubt. Under the facts of this case, from this video, as we've just gone through it, how could anyone say beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Bryan, having turned away, that he didn't come back for the right reasons? How can one say that he's lied on February 23rd when he says he was trying to get a recording of Mr. Arbery, that he was trying to document what was going on because he thought Mr. Arbery was going to get away and he wanted the police to have that information? Those aren't my words. Those are his words, way back, moments after the shooting. Now, having seen that Mr. Bryan was going away and then turned around and put the video back up, how is that not a reasonable doubt in this case? Now, I don't know what Ms. Dunikowski is going to say, is going to say when she gets back up here. I do know that it seems like every technician in creation has been involved in this case. Drone this, footage that, filter this, enhance that. We got 20 million frames of every second of the footage in this case. But how, in the course of all that work, does someone who's practically computer illiterate figure out that they have this case all wrong? How is that possible? And how do you know that? Count the gear shifts, ladies and gentlemen. The state's theory is that there's 3 shifts, 3 changes in direction. That's 6 gear shifts. They're not audible. We know what happened. And I don't care what Travis McMichael says. I don't care what anybody else says. I'm looking at the video, and I'm listening for the changes. You know that when this, right here, when Mr. Arbery turns around, and whatever Mr. Bryan thinks he's doing with the wheel, I don't see much actual movement, okay? I see him at 2 miles an hour, and then his foot's off the gas pedal. Whatever Mr. Bryan thinks he did, I don't think it was much. But you know that he's driving away from Mr. Arbery at this point because he can't go back and then go back and then go back again because there aren't enough gear shifts. All right, I think we're done with that one. I want to talk to you about felony murder. Now, there are more capable lawyers than I in this courtroom, and they certainly have come up with great ways to analyze all these things that make it simple. I'm just not quite as adept as they are. So if I take a little longer, I apologize. The predicate offenses for the felony murder counts, those are counts 2, 3, 4, and 5, or counts 6, 7, 8, and 9. And I will address each of the underlying or predicate felonies in a moment. But right now I want to talk about something called proximate cause. Because to support any of the felony murder counts in this case, there has to be a causal relationship to the death of Ahmaud Arbery. And there is no such relationship in this case. Without trying to put words in the court's mouth, I think the court's going to charge you, well, I'm not there yet. You may find the defendant guilty of felony murder if you believe that Mr. Bryan caused the death of Mr. Arbery, regardless of whether Mr. Bryan intended the death to occur. That's felony murder. There must be some causal connection between the felony and the death. The court, I believe, will instruct you that felony murder is not established simply because the death occurred at the same time or shortly after the felony was attempted or committed. The burden on the state is much greater. The felony must have been directly caused, or must have directly caused the death, or played both a substantial and necessary part in causing the death. In this case, you may also consider whether any intervening act, those are my words, whether on the part of the McMichaels or Mr. Arbery were sufficient to break the causal chain of events. Actually, I believe both of the lawyers that preceded me for the McMichael defendants have pointed out the error in the state's argument here. Listen carefully to the court's charge. The words "but for" appear nowhere in that charge. They are not to be found. Why? Because "but for" is not the standard. It's too easy a standard. It's too low a standard. It doesn't meet the law. Why? Mr. Sheffield pointed out that but for, I think, Mr. Travis McMichael's grandparents, Travis McMichael wouldn't have been there. Likewise, I would say, but for Roddy Bryan's birth, there's no way that this crime could have taken place under the state's reasoning. You know, the same thing could be said, but for Larry English installing surveillance cameras. The McMichaels would never have known that this was the fellow running by them. But for Matt Albenzi pulling out his wood chipper that day and working in the front yard, he never would have saw Mr. Arbery. But for the actions of Robert Rash and Diego Perez, this incident might not have happened. But for Mr. Albenzi calling the normal police number instead of 911, the police might have responded faster and things might have been different. But for Mr. Albenzi cutting off the Satilla Drive exit, Mr. Arbery might have escaped. But for 100 different things, all of which had to come together in the exact sequence for this tragedy to take place, it could not have happened. So simply saying that but for Mr. Bryan being there that day, that's not the standard. And the state doesn't even try and meet the standard that the court is going to instruct you on. And maybe they're just waiting until they have the last word. And all I can say about that is that's just dirty pool. And I certainly hope that's not what's going on. Now, again, with all respect to the state, who have some very capable lawyers, when we look objectively at the events of February 23rd, I would respectfully submit to you that Roddy Bryan's presence is absolutely superfluous and irrelevant to the tragic death of Ahmaud Arbery. Now, that may not be intuitively obvious, but if you think about it, I believe you'll agree. Had Roddy Bryan stayed in bed that day, if Roddy Bryan had stayed on his front porch, would Ahmaud Arbery be alive today? If the state's theory is that these men, and I'm not saying that's the case, you decide what the deal is with the co-defendants, but if the theory is that these men were vigilantes and harbored some ill will towards Mr. Arbery, then what difference does it make whether Roddy Bryan is there or not? Mr. Arbery can't outrun bullets. They've been chasing him for a while, and he's at practically point-blank range even before he comes around the truck. The problem is, for the state, that Mr. Albenzi, thankfully not indicted, not yet anyway, Mr. Albenzi is down the street with his firearm. Roddy Bryan doesn't know that. That's why Roddy Bryan goes down Satilla momentarily as Mr. Bryan is turning up the road. You'll remember the testimony where the state was trying to say that Mr. Bryan was trying to run him over, when in fact, Mr. Arbery had already turned up Holmes by the time Mr. Bryan put his car in reverse. One of them, several times, they incorrectly stated he was trying to run Mr. Arbery over. The reason that Mr. Bryan is continuing down Satilla is he doesn't know that Mr. Albenzi is there. He can't. But Mr. Arbery does, which is why Mr. Arbery is not going to go down that way. Now, my point to you is, Mr. Arbery is on foot. The McMichaels are in a pickup truck. We know they circle around all the way up Zellwood to the top of Holmes. How does Mr. Bryan's presence on the road that day, whatever he thought he was doing, okay? Because if the idea is that he imprisoned Mr. Arbery by himself, that somehow and those are the words he uses, that he cornered Mr. Arbery by himself, I guess, between his truck and the mailbox. I don't know, between his truck and the marsh. I don't know. The state will have to explain the theory to you. But the truck can go a lot faster. Mr. Arbery, if he's superhuman, might be doing 5 or 6 miles an hour, maybe 7. That pickup truck is capable of probably driving 100 miles an hour, maybe 90. Mr. Bryan's presence on the road has nothing to do with the ability of the McMichael defendants to cut Mr. Arbery off. Why? Because even though Roddy Bryan doesn't know it, Matt Albenzi's cut off one of the 2 exits from the neighborhood, and the McMichaels are already at the top of homes. They've cut off the second. Mr. Bryan is not trapping Mr. Arbery. He's trapped the moment the McMichaels get to the top of homes. It doesn't really matter what Roddy does. Now, they do come down the road, and there is a brief time period before the shooting where technically Mr. Bryan is behind Mr. Arbery. But it's clear by this point, it's certainly clear to Mr. Arbery, that he cannot outrun the McMichaels. No matter where he goes, they can follow. So again, how is Mr. Bryan's presence on this day in any meaningful way the cause of this shooting? And by the time Mr. Bryan gets around the dog leg, Mr. Arbery is already well within range of the shotgun that Travis McMichael is holding and the handgun that Gregory McMichael has. So if their intention, and again, I'm not suggesting that it's their intention, but if the McMichaels meant harm to Mr. Arbery, if they meant to shoot him that day, what in the world does Mr. Bryan's presence out there have to do with anything? I would submit to you that this is basically all a smokescreen from the state, because Mr. Bryan's presence doesn't contribute in a direct or substantial way to the death of Mr. Arbery.